Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks very much to the organisers for doing a really great job with this. We're going to our presentation today. Sorry, I'm just going to start the Zoom. Our presentation today is about the case of on by an ergative objects comparing the languages, Polynesian languages, Samoan and Niuean. So this sort of our starting point is this long-held view in syntactic theory that transitive predicates and ergative predicates have got something of a uniform syntactic analysis, in that both require subjects that are merged VP externally, as shown in 1. Sorry, I'm just going to make sure my time is going properly. Yeah, as shown in 1, so we have external arguments of both transitive and ergative subjects under this view merged in the specifier of little VP, and then internal arguments, so subjects of unaccusatives and objects of transitives are merged VP internally. So the difference then between unergatives and transitives lies in whether we posit that an overt object is present, as in transitives, or absent, as in unergatives. A quick side note that we are going to be adopting a modified version of the tree in 1 a little bit later, but that's going to be our jumping off point. So what happens with case licensing in unergative constructions? And for intransitive unergatives, so what we might think of as prototypical unergative constructions, we've got 2 options. The first one is that these are actually always covertly transitive. They involve a covert cognate object, and this object just gets licensed in the same way as a transitive object in prototypical transitive constructions. The view that second view that we're going to be adopting is that whatever case value is designated for prototypical transitive objects, such as accusative case, just simply goes unassigned in transitive unergative constructions. Our focus for today, however, is what happens when there actually is an overt object, and we're going to refer to these collectively as unergative objects, but what we mean by unergative objects are cognate objects such as in I danced a dance, and hyponymic objects as in I danced a waltz. So if we think about nominative languages, well, the most straightforward answer concerning an unergative object would be that it gets whatever case would be designated for a prototypical transitive object. And if we look at nominative accusative languages like Japanese and Hebrew, this appears to be true. So let's take a look now. So in the Japanese in 2, we have the child kicked a ball, a prototypical transitive in 2a, and the ball has accusative case. And in 2b, the unergative object dance, as in the child danced a dance, also has accusative case. And we see the same pattern in Hebrew. Dana loved this dance in 3a. The dance has accusative case. And then when this dance is an unergative object, as in 3b, Dana danced this dance, it also has accusative case. Turning to ergative languages, we see more variation in what we can get. And we're going to use the closely related Polynesian languages, Samoan and Niuean, as a window into investigating this variation. Now, Samoan and Niuean are very interesting to compare because both of them have what we can straightforwardly think of as an ergative absolutive alignment, and subjects of intransitive and ergative verbs consistently get absolutive case. So that's shown in 4 and 5. So in 4a, we have a Samoan transitive, the man built the house. You have ergative absolutive, sa faile tamaloa le faile. And in Niuean, we also have ergative absolutive, the man built the house, ne tangata tane e faile. And then with an intransitive unergative, just like the subject of an intransitive unaccusative, the subject of an intransitive unergative has absolutive case. So the girl danced in both instances, the girl has absolutive case. But the interesting point of comparison comes in when ergative constructions are transitivized, and it's at this point where we see a difference between the 2 languages. So in Samoan, you have sasiva leteni ilasiva. The subject retains absolutive case, and the object is marked with this prenominal E marker. In Niuean, nekole tamafifine ekoli, the girl danced a dance, you have the ergative absolutive case pattern that you would see with prototypical transitives. So this gave rise to 2 questions for us. So firstly, what difference or differences underlie the syntax of Samoan and Niuean that could give rise to this contrast? And secondly, and more broadly speaking, methodologically, how can we use transitivized and ergative constructions as a means of diagnosing the nature of ergative case or of a case system more generally? So our proposal with respect to the first point, we're going to say that the difference stems from the interaction of 3 points of parametric variation in the syntax. Firstly, and most importantly, there's accusative case on little v in Samoan, but not in Niuean. Secondly, the locus of absolutive case differs between the 2 languages, namely it's high, as in it's on T in Samoan, and low on little v in Niuean. And thirdly, the nature of the ergative case assigning head is also a point of difference between the two languages. We're going to call it voice in Samoan and apple in Niuean. So a quick roadmap, we're going to start by giving a background to the two languages and to our assumptions concerning case assignment. We'll then talk about the split V in voice structure, which is an extension of the structure that I showed right at the beginning in the tree in 1. We're then going to talk about middle verbs, which instantiate a type of split ergative patterning. We'll then go through the ingredients of the proposal, and then we'll conclude. So the background for Samoan and Niuean, I'm not going to go through the demographics of the two languages. They've been already talked about at AFLA thus far. Great. But both of them, as you've heard, have verb initial word order. So we can see this in 7 in A for Samoan and B for Niuean. You get the tense aspect mood marker, the verb, the subject, and the object. And VSO word order is obligatory for Niuean. In Samoan, you can have VSO or VOS, and this is a point we'll come back to later on, but VSO is the more default word order. Nothing crucial hinges in our analysis of case on how we derive verb initiality, but just we are going to be showing some trees, and it could be derived via right side specifier, head movement, phrasal movement. We're going to assume, following Massam 2001 and Collins 2016, that it's derived via remnant VP movement as shown in 8. So we have the object having escaped the VP and the whole VP raising to a position below that which hosts the tense aspect mood marker. So our background concerning case assignment, we're going to be adopting an approach in which case is assigned by syntactic heads and not configurationally as independent case theory. This type of dependent case theory hasn't been adopted in the syntactic literature on Polynesian, and importantly, it's particularly problematic for Niuean, as Diane has motivated in her recent book. So we're going to call upon distinctions between obligatory case licenses and secondary case licenses, following many authors in previous literature. Obligatory case licenses are nominative and absolutive, and secondary case licenses, ergative and accusative. And we're going to formalize this distinction by within the realms of feature interpretability or uninterpretability. And we're going to posit that case on obligatory case licensing heads is uninterpretable, meaning that it must be assigned over the course of the derivation in order for the derivation to converge. But it's interpretable on secondary licensing heads, meaning that it can be absent or go unassigned. And just a quick side note, by interpretable or uninterpretable, we mean interpretable in terms of feature checking, not necessarily interpretable in terms of the semantics. So we're adopting a feature checking based approach here. Concerning nominative and absolutive, we posit that they're first assigned first to the C command, to a qualifying nominal in their C command domain by the head that assigns the relevant case. But in the absence of such a nominal in the C command domain, the head can then look to its specifier and assign the case up to its specifier. And this is adopting a modified version of Behar and Rezak's cyclic agreed approach. With absolutive case, we're going to posit variation, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. In Samoan, absolutive is high, and in Niuean, absolutive is low. The distinction between ergative and accusative is one we're going to formalize. We're going to couch within a theory of directionality. So this is shown in 9, and just for the trees here, we're remaining neutral as to we're just calling them X and Y. We're remaining neutral as to the identity of the relevant heads, because we'll touch on that. We'll come to that later on. But accusative is a case is assigned via C command to the closest case needy DP in the C command domain of the head. And ergative case is what we call spec head. It's assigned via the head to the argument in its specifier. And this is in the spirit of, it's not quite adopting wholesale, but it's in the spirit of Assmann et al. 2015, who argues in a similar vein that the difference between ergative and accusative is one of timing. We're positing that it's one of directionality. So our background concerning the distinction between transitives and ergatives, the starting point for this, or the next building point, is that building upon the structure shown right at the beginning, back in 1 at the beginning, it's been argued that at least some languages exhibit a split V in voice domain, something like what we have in 10, where little v verbalizes the root and introduces causative semantics, and voice is responsible for introducing the external argument, assigning it a theta role, and in some languages for licensing the internal argument. And a recent extension of this posits that both split, some languages have a split V and voice structure in which both little v and voice can introduce an external argument. And this has been argued for by a number of authors, including both of ourselves. So we'll show that in 11. So what we have here is an ergative subject being introduced in the specifier of little vp, and transitive subjects, I should say most transitive subjects, being introduced in the specifier of voice. And this is associated with two versions of the agent theta role, which we're going to call low agent and high agent. And just a side note, we will be adopting Harley 2017, who argues that splitting versus bundling of VP and voice P is a parameter of cross-linguistic variation. So we're not necessarily expecting that every language has what we would see in 11. Some languages might have a bundled V and voice domain. So coming on to Polynesian verb classes and implementing this split V and voice domain within Polynesian. So we're going to talk next about middle verbs, which are an instantiation of what we might think of as a split ergative pattern, in that they are verbs like what we see in 12a for Samoan, Imanao, Latamaiti, Lamasi. They have two arguments, but they don't have the ergative absolutive case frame that's associated with prototypical transitives. Instead, at least in Samoan, the subject gets absolutive case and the object is marked with this same prenominal E marker that we saw with transitive and ergatives. In Niuean, we have something similar. Manakoila tamaki niu, the child wants the coconut, the child gets absolutive case, and the object is marked with what we're glossing neutrally for now as kehe case. And middle verbs are typically what we might think of as lower in transitivity in the sense of Hopper and Thompson 1981. So they encode they're usually verbs of perception, communication, emotion, experience. Just a note, we're not going to show the data on this for the sake of time, but the middle objects, Masi and Niu in these languages, behave as direct objects in both languages, at least insofar as they can undergo pseudo-incorporation. However, there is a critical difference between Samoan and Niuean, which we'll come back to a bit later on. So if we look at ergative objects again, we can put this pattern, the pattern that we're seeing, into greater perspective. Because in Samoan, we can see that when you transitivize an ergative, you're following the middle case frame, the girl danced the waltz. Speakers really do not like the ergative absolutive case frame with a transitivized ergative. So what we have at the bottom left here, sasive lateni lewisi, is rejected, it's out. In Niuean, we have the reverse. So you can't use the middle case frame when you transitivize an ergative. You have to use the ergative absolutive case frame. So just going back to what we said about case and these two subject positions, well, if we were assuming what we had back in 1 and that every language has a bundled V and voice head at V voice domain, then taking a spec head approach to ergative case predicts that all external arguments in Samoan and Niuean should be ergative, but that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing some are ergative, namely subjects of, well, ergative subjects, and some are absolutive subjects of middles. And in previous work, I've argued for Samoan that this contrast corresponds to the partition of subjects across spec of little VP and spec of voice P following from Massam 2009. So spec VP introduces subjects that end up getting absolutive case, and spec voice P introduces subjects that end up getting ergative case. So little v in this structure introduces basic semantic properties of agentivity, such as initiation and experience of an event, and these are associated with low agents, which are subjects of ergatives and middles. And voice introduces additional properties such as effort, volition, instigation of a change in state of another entity, and these characterize high agents. And critically, voice assigns ergative case to the argument in its specifier in a spec head relationship. So we're showing this here in 15. I won't go through it in too much detail, but we have the ergative and middle subjects in the specifier of little vp and ergative subjects in the specifier of voice p. And primary evidence for these two positions comes from the patterning of causative constructions. We're not going to go through the data for the sake of time, but please feel welcome to ask us about it in the discussion period or some later point. The question we then have to address is, well, with Samoan, ergative subjects consistently get absolutive case regardless of whether there's an object or not. But for Niuean, they get absolutive case only when there's no object. They get ergative case when there is an object. So why is there seemingly two anergative subject positions for Niuean but not for Samoan? So we're coming on to our proposal, and our proposal has got three components. The first and the most important is the presence of or absence of accusative case. So in previous work, I've analysed Samoan middle case as structural accusative case that's assigned under C command to the object by little b when the VP specifier is occupied by a low agent. And this takes into account the observation that Samoan middle E case is cognate with the accusative E marker in Polynesian languages like Maori and Hawaiian that have got a nominative accusative alignment. Furthermore, Samoan middle objects behave like direct objects, not only with respect to pseudonoun incorporation, but also with respect to quantifier float, and this is shown in 16. So you can see in 16a that you can float a quantifier off of an absolutive object, as in I ate all the bananas. You can't float a quantifier off of an oblique DP, as in I went to all the villages of Tonga. And for a middle object, you can float a quantifier. So he loves all the girls in the village, you can float the quantifier off of the middle object. And the same is true of an ergative object. So he danced all the dancers, you can float the quantifier off of the ergative object. So just to schematize accusative case in Samoan, we're going to posit that it's assigned by little b under C command to the object, and absolutive case is assigned by T to the subject. We'll come back to the locus of absolutive case in a moment. And then ergative case, when we have ergative constructions, we have this additional voice projection, and ergative case is assigned in a spec-head relationship to the subject in the specifier of voice P, and this frees up absolutive case to be designated for the object on absolutive case from T. If we turn to Niuean, however, we find that in contrast to Samoan middle case, Niuean Kehe middle case in fact doesn't behave as a structural case, so it's not behaving like an accusative case. But instead it comprises two freestanding morphemes, firstly K, which is a cognate of Proto-Polynesian oblique key, and He, which functions as a locative marker, as in examples like 17. So we're all going in the car, we're all going He motoka. Furthermore, unlike in Samoan, Niuean middle objects don't allow for a floated quantifier. So here we're seeing a difference between the patterning of another difference between the patterning of middle objects. If you want to say something like what we see in 18, I've already listened to all of your questions, you have to leave the quantifier, the object quantifier in situ. You cannot raise it as in, you can't float it as in 18b. And what we're arguing for here is that middle case in Niuean is not structural, but it's lexical. It's assigned by big V to its complement. It's available on a particular subset, lexical subset of V's. And critically, this subset does not include anergative verbs. And that's schematized there in 19. The second component is variation in the locus of absolutive case. So in Samoan, we're going to posit that absolutive is assigned high by T, following some of my own previous work. This means that first in line for absolutive case is the subject, unless the subject has already got ergative case. This means that subjects of all anergatives and all middles straightforwardly receive absolutive case, they're first in line, and the object gets accusative case, and there's no voice P, so no ergative case. In Niuean, however, following from previous authors, we're going to say that absolutive case is assigned low by little b. This means that unlike in Samoan, the first in line for absolutive case in Niuean is the object, unless the object already has lexical middle case or there just isn't one present. Therefore, it's objects of transitive anergatives that receive absolutive case. And further evidence in favour of this high-low absolutive contrast was motivated in Lauren Clemens's earlier talk, so I'm not going to go through it now, but I'll just say that Samoan is like Tongan in that it has ergative extraction restrictions and it has variable post-verbal word order, whereas Niuean has neither. So focusing on transitive anergatives in Niuean, we've said firstly that there's no accusative case, and secondly that absolutive is low and therefore is first destined for an object. So this means that the subject of an anergative, if it merges in the specifier of little bp, is going to be left caseless and the derivation is going to fall apart. So this means that it can't be accommodated in this position. So there's only one option left, and that is to merge it in the specifier of a projection in which it can receive ergative case, which is voice P, and you'll see in a minute why we're putting voice P in scare quotes. The question then is, how can this be accommodated? So this brings us on to component 3, which is the nature of the ergative case assigning head. In Samoan, voice assigns ergative case to semantic high agents, and these agents can either be volitional or non-volitional, although there's a possibility that there is some dialectal variation here. And an ergative subject is a semantic low agent, and it doesn't merge there, therefore it just never gets ergative case. In Niuean, however, voice assigns ergative case to an agent which VP cannot accommodate. But unlike in Samoan, it's got a condition on it that these agents, the agents that merge here, must be volitional. And just as a side note, but an important one, non-volitional agents merge in a different projection, which you're very welcome to ask us about. The subjective and transitive ergative meets these conditions, and therefore it can merge there. I'll just go a minute or so over. So for voice in Niuean, we therefore propose that voice P in Niuean is not a core verbal projection, rather it's one of 2 dedicated valence increasing heads, which we're going to label as apple following Massam 2020, and that's shown there in 20. So we have apple above little vp, and apple assigns, this type of apple accommodates volitional agents, and it assigns ergative case in spec head. So if we put it all together for transitive and ergatives, in Samoan, the object gets accusative case from little v. In Niuean, there's no accusative case. In Samoan, the subject gets absolutive case from t. In Niuean, the object gets absolutive case from v. Voice p isn't projected in Samoan. And in Niuean, the subject can't be accommodated in little vp, so it merges higher in apple p, where it gets ergative case. So just to conclude, we've seen that Samoan and Niuean both have basic ergative case systems, yet the syntax of these systems differ in subtle and far-reaching ways. So there's the data from the beginning again, and we see the man built the house, ergative, absolutive in both languages, and the girl danced in transitive and ergative absolutive subject. But it's where we see when we transitivize an ergative subject, as shown at the bottom, where we see a difference, and this difference we saying offers key insights into diagnosing the true nature of an underlying nature of a case system. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 8 minutes for questions. Elena has a question.
I can't hear.
Yeah, no, it's because I wasn't allowed to unmute myself. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks for the talk. It's really fascinating and kind of a neat corner. Like you say, it gives an insight into the case system. So I guess my question is just more if you could talk a little bit more about this apple head that's being posited in Niuean and why we want to call it apple. And, yeah, maybe Diane has to answer that question.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm unmuted, am I? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, for this talk, we could call it voice. The reason, I mean, there's complicated, you know, long reasons why I think it's apple. But one point is, as Becky mentioned, there is another applicative head that accommodates non-volitional external arguments. So non-volitional agents, as in under causatives, and instruments, and agents like the wind or the heater warm the room, or the wind, whatever. And those are really clearly applicative because you get an applicative marker on the verb, and it's sort of a normal apple. So I sort of think the symmetry of seeing the two apple heads is kind of pleasing. But I mean, my own reasons are kind of complicated that I spell out in the book, that I think there is a voice that's lower down and it introduces the theta role of the agent, but doesn't actually introduce the DP agent that comes in higher. So you know, those are sort of not relevant for this talk. So I think, again, for this talk, we could have just called it voice and nothing would be different. Does that answer the question? And Becky, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna, well, we could call it voice, but there's also the difference between Samoan and Niuean in terms of the semantic conditions. So that was part of the motivation, the semantic conditions on the agent. So that was part of the motivation for wanting to actually call it something different, just to make that super clear.
Thank you.
I think
Ine has a question. Yeah. I think you're able to unmute yourself now. You should be. I'm sorry for the difficulty.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, guys. So, yeah, so since Elena asked the question about the apple, since it can assign ergative, why can't it combine with the voice head that also assigns ergative?
It could. I think that's the same answer, right? You're saying, why couldn't voice and apple be the same thing?
No, why don't we ever get clauses where there are two ergative arguments then?
Oh, I see.
Yeah, because one of the advantages of talking about apple in causatives is that you will never get that ergative case on the causee. So adding an apple erg might mess up that kind of proposal.
No, it works. I mean, apple erg also introduces causers. It's a different flavor of apple. So there's a causer or an agent, and they're both introduced by apple. And that's the only location where you get ergative case. So there couldn't be another ergative.
Yeah, there's only one version of the ergative apple. So there'd only ever be one instantiation of ergative case.
You can get two apples. One assigns ergative case and one assigns absolutive. So in a causative, the causer would be ergative, and then the causee is now assigned absolutive case by a lower sort of instrumental apple, and then the theme is assigned absolutive case as any object. So
okay, I think I misunderstood then. So you're saying that in Niuean, the what we often call the voice head is always going to be apple.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, what we're saying. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I get it now.
Yeah.
But
I mean, as I said in answer to Elena, like, I think for this talk, it doesn't really matter if you want to call it voice. The reasons for calling it apple involve things that we didn't talk about in this talk. So, you know, if you want to call it voice, you can call it voice. It's just that it's distinct from the Samoan voice, which has different properties and they behave differently. And that we don't see until we look at these transitive unergatives, as Becky was saying, right? We don't even see it until you look there.
Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Christine Yu has a question.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned something about the PNI difference between Samoan and Niuean, but didn't go into it too much. Could you say a little bit more about what that is and how that bears on your proposal?
The difference there isn't. The difference is with quantifier float.
Oh, okay. So there's no what is on slide 19.
Oh,
slide
maybe
19 when you mentioned PNI.
Sorry, okay, so so the quantifier float. Yeah, we're not too sure how exactly how the quantifier, like how the syntax of it all works out with the quantifier float. I don't think there is an analysis of quantifier float in Samoan, or is there, that I'm missing? But it's just some evidence that the unergative and middle objects, further evidence that the unergative and middle objects are behaving like core objects. But in Niuean, we're not seeing the same thing, in that they're behaving like core objects with respect to pseudo-noun incorporation, but they're not behaving like core objects that get a structural case when we think about quantifier float. So we are associating quantifier float with something as being related to structural case, but we're not entirely sure how that is going to be formally implemented yet.
Both Chung originally, I think, and Cider also sort of argue the same thing, that in some Polynesian languages like Samoan, there's evidence that the middle objects are direct objects syntactically, but in Niuean, they do not behave like direct objects. They don't undergo quantifier float, they also don't undergo raising, and they don't undergo reciprocalization. So there's a number of ways in which the Niuean middle objects do not behave like direct objects syntactically. However, they do undergo PNI. So our analysis is that they are in the object position and therefore eligible for PNI, but they're marked with an oblique case, and that sort of rules them out from various syntactic operations that can apply to direct objects. So the inherent case analysis is the one that's, to us, separating their behavior with respect to PNI and other syntactic tests for objecthood.